January 17, 1944, Camp Swift, Texas. The desert air is still, the kind of silence that comes only after lights out. Inside a makeshift hall of timber and canvas, the hum of a generator shudders through the night. Rows of wooden benches fill with men in faded Feldgrau uniforms, prisoners of the Third Reich. Their boots confiscated, their belts surrendered. Yet tonight, they're permitted to gather. At the far end, a beam of light cuts through the dark. Dust dances in its path. A reel begins to turn. The first frame of an American film. On screen, cowboys gallop beneath vast skies, and the sound of gunfire echoes in the hall. Some prisoners smirk. Others stare entranced. It is not the violence that shocks them. It is the laughter, the music, the easy rhythm of a life unburdened by ideology. They whisper to each other in disbelief. "They let us watch this?" Outside, a U.S. guard leans against the wall, listening to the laughter of the very men he fought against months before. For a moment, war feels distant, replaced by something far stranger: curiosity. The flicker of that projector becomes the faint glow of freedom, reaching even behind barbed wire. By the winter of 1944, the United States had become a reluctant warden of an army it never meant to house. More than 425,000 German prisoners of war were now scattered across the American heartland, from the pine forests of Alabama to the plains of Kansas and the deserts of Arizona. They had crossed an ocean in defeat, captured in North Africa, Italy, and later in the hedgerows of Normandy. What awaited them was not the cruelty they had been warned about, but something far more bewildering: normalcy. Under the strict guidelines of the Geneva Convention of 1929, the U.S. military established an extensive network of over 600 main camps and 1 in 500 branch camps, built often near rail lines or agricultural hubs. The goal was practical: feed the prisoners, keep them occupied, and supply American farms and factories with much-needed labor, while domestic workers went to war. Yet what emerged was not merely a logistical success. It was a social experiment. To the German soldiers arriving from the battlefront, the first sight of America was surreal. The train windows revealed landscapes untouched by war. No bomb craters, no ruins, no hunger lines. The farms were vast, the silos full, and towns flickered with neon signs. It was a civilization untouched by the devastation consuming Europe. At first, disbelief hardened into suspicion. Nazi propaganda had described America as a land of chaos, crime, and racial decay, a degenerate culture of capitalism that would collapse under its own greed. Yet here they were, given adequate food, clean barracks, and even pay for their labor. Some guards treated them with casual decency, offering cigarettes or casual conversation. The ideological wall began to tremble, not from force, but from exposure to contradiction. For U.S. officials, this compliance with international law was more than humanitarian principle. It was psychological strategy. Colonel Edward Davison, a specialist in psychological warfare, argued that how America treated its prisoners could shape the post-war mind of Germany. By allowing POWs to witness democracy in small, daily gestures, the fairness of rations, the impartiality of guards, the abundance of consumer goods, the U.S. could plant seeds of doubt in men raised under totalitarian obedience. This approach stood in sharp contrast to the conditions in Germany's own camps. In the Reich, Allied prisoners endured cold barracks, restricted correspondence, and constant surveillance. Yet in America, many German captives found themselves working side by side with civilians, learning English, and sometimes even invited to local church services or holiday dinners. For the townspeople, the POWs were an odd curiosity, the enemy made human. By late 1943, the War Department recognized this phenomenon as a soft power tool. Reports circulated through the Office of War. Information, OE noting how the humane treatment of prisoners could serve as a living exhibit of democratic civilization. In Audiobooks, an era when bombs and tanks defined the world. This quiet form of persuasion, rooted in fairness and familiarity, carried its own strategic weight. Still, the German prisoners were not easily swayed. For many, especially officers and ideologues, the American order felt alien and hollow, a mechanical abundance without spiritual depth. But for younger men, conscripts pulled into the machinery of war. The encounter with America began to erode inherited beliefs. Letters home, censored but carefully archived, began to reflect this subtle shift. One POW in Camp Shelby wrote, "We were told Americans were barbarians, but they give us 3 meals a day and show us their films. It is not what we expected." In those quiet screenings, whether westerns, musicals, or wartime newsreels, they glimpsed a culture driven not by fear, but by confidence. The screen became a mirror of contrast, the unrestrained laughter of moviegoers against the rigid conformity of the Reich. Thus, when the first reels flickered through the projectors of the prison camps, it was more than entertainment. It was the next step in an unspoken campaign, one that would challenge the very foundations of German ideology. And as that light filled the barracks, America discovered a peculiar form of influence. Not through sermons or leaflets, but through cinema. By mid-1944, the U.S. War Department's focus turned from merely managing thousands of German prisoners to quietly influencing them. The Office of War Information and the Special Projects Division of the Army Service Forces began to see the camps not only as containment zones, but as classrooms, laboratories of democracy set behind barbed wire. Their guiding theory was simple. A man fed well and treated fairly might begin to question a regime that told him Americans were monsters. The shift was formalized in 1943 when Colonel Edward Davison, a poet-turned-psychologist who had helped design wartime propaganda programs, was appointed to head the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division. His mission was not re-education in the coercive sense used by totalitarian regimes, but reorientation through exposure. The difference was crucial. Instead of lectures on politics, the Germans would be allowed to see American life functioning. Its press, its music, its arguments, its films. Inside each major camp, orientation sections distributed newspapers, arranged English classes, and screened motion pictures cleared by the War Department. The titles were chosen with care. Stagecoach, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy. None preached ideology outright. They depicted ordinary people wrestling with law, corruption, and moral choice. In those stories, the German viewer confronted something absent from Nazi cinema: the flawed but functioning machinery of democracy. Military censors monitored reactions closely. Reports from Camp Atterbury, Indiana, and Camp Hearn, Texas, note astonishment among new arrivals, who expected hatred, but found instead a spirit of ease and plenty. When Mr. Smith Goes to Washington played, one guard recorded that prisoners whispered to each other, "If such films are allowed, their government must not fear the people." It was an observation no amount of leaflets could produce. To the American command, this was a quiet victory. They had learned that abundance itself was propaganda. The taste of white bread, the sight of overflowing canteens, and the weekly film nights spoke louder than any lecture. In camp canteens, prisoners could buy chocolate bars, magazines, even postcards of Hollywood stars. The projector's beam became the symbol of that abundance, light spilling effortlessly from a humming machine, projecting a vision of a world at peace with itself. Not all reacted with gratitude. A minority of hardcore Nazis, organized into Zellen cells, saw these privileges as dangerous softness. They warned others that the Americans used sugar to poison. Fights broke out in some compounds between loyalists and those who began to doubt the Reich. The War Department quietly segregated the zealots into separate camps, allowing the majority to absorb the new reality without intimidation. Meanwhile, U.S. newspapers reported the humane treatment of prisoners as proof of moral superiority. Public sentiment oscillated. Some citizens protested that German soldiers lived better than their own rationed families. But Washington held firm. The treatment of POWs, officials argued, was an investment in the post-war world. Every camp could become a seedbed for a democratic Germany. By the war's end, the U.S. would have spent millions not merely housing its captives, but introducing them to America. The policy's success could not be measured in surrendered weapons, but in changed minds. Intangible, slow, but real. Many of those minds were being reshaped not in classrooms, but in the darkened halls where Hollywood flickered across rough wooden screens. That glow, once a curiosity, would soon become the battlefield of ideas. The place where laughter replaced propaganda, and a projector's hum drowned the voice of tyranny. For most German prisoners, daily life in America settled into a rhythm that was both monotonous and strangely comforting. They woke at dawn to roll call, marched to breakfast, often eggs, bread, and coffee, and spent the day in labor detachments or camp workshops. Compared to the starvation and ruin awaiting their families back home, it felt like a strange dream. They were the defeated, yet they were eating better than they had on the front. The first shock was freedom within confinement. Inside the fences, guards enforced discipline, but rarely cruelty. Work parties left camp unarmed, driven by American sergeants who seemed indifferent to politics. Some allowed prisoners to chat with farmers, to taste local fruit, even to mail home pay vouchers. It was a civilization so confident it did not fear kindness. Many POWs began to keep journals, thin notebooks filled with English words and sketches of the land that would later fill memoirs published across post-war Germany. Evenings carried another ritual. After supper, when the heat faded, prisoners gathered near the recreation hall. A generator coughed to life. The air filled with its low thrum. Then the light, white, unwavering, flooded the wall. The projector's beam sliced the dark like a searchlight. But instead of seeking escapees, it revealed another world. On the screen, Cary Grant chasing spies across the sky, Jimmy Stewart defending justice, Jean Arthur laughing in a diner. For men trained to despise America, these images were disarming. Letters and interrogation summaries preserved their astonishment. One NCO wrote, "They have no fear of showing corruption or failure in their films. That is strength." Another noted, "The people in their movies live freely, even against their government. And yet nothing collapses." In those darkened halls, the contrast between expectation and reality became visceral. The Reich's rigid world of obedience and censorship began to seem fragile beside the effortless confidence of American laughter. Some reacted defensively, clinging to pride. Others surrendered quietly. Not their loyalty, but their certainty. The war's front lines dissolved inside the mind. For the first time, they could imagine a Germany without the voice of command. And in the background, the hum of the projector kept turning, like a clock marking the slow passage from fanaticism to curiosity. That curiosity would deepen as prisoners began to question not just propaganda, but the very architecture of authority itself. Their captors, without speeches, were teaching them the grammar of freedom. If the first impact of America's cinema was emotional, the second was ideological and far more deliberate. Within the guarded perimeters of hundreds of camps, the U.S. military had recognized that film could serve as the purest demonstration of democratic strength. It was not persuasion by argument, but persuasion by spectacle, by confidence. The Special Projects Division, working with the Office of War Information, curated film reels like a syllabus in freedom. No slogans, no lectures, just America, unfiltered, flickering in black and white. Westerns taught about justice through personal conscience rather than command. Comedies mocked the powerful without fear of reprisal. Musicals, exuberant and excessive, revealed a nation so wealthy in spirit it could afford joy in wartime. Each film was an unspoken rebuttal to totalitarian logic. That control was strength, and laughter was weakness. In camp reports from 1944, psychologists noted that the impact of cinema exceeded all other educational programs combined. After screenings of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, some POWs debated whether a government could truly allow criticism of itself without collapse. After Casablanca, they argued over whether loyalty to ideals could outweigh loyalty to the state. These were not questions raised in Nazi Germany. Yet now, inside barbed wire, they circulated freely, carried by men who had once shouted oaths to Hitler. To U.S. officers overseeing this soft power mission, the results were profound. One report concluded, "The German prisoner has begun to distinguish between discipline and tyranny, between patriotism and obedience. What years of propaganda could not achieve, 2 hours of celluloid often did." The prisoners saw an America that was not a faceless enemy, but a collection of individuals, flawed, humorous, and astonishingly self-assured. Not all reactions were acceptance. For every man awakened, another turned defensive, calling the films tricks of decadence. Yet even their rejection betrayed doubt. The light of the projector reached corners that interrogation could not. It lingered after the reels stopped turning, a ghostly echo on the mind. As one camp interpreter observed, they walk back to their barracks, talking about the movie. The arguments last longer than the war will. In that sense, the projector light became a quiet weapon of democracy, unthreatening yet invasive, dissolving rigid ideology not by assault but by contrast. It showed that in America, ideas were not forbidden objects. They were furniture in a public room, open to all who entered. For the German soldier trained to obey, this revelation was both liberating and disorienting. Beyond the fences, the same reels played to American audiences, who saw heroes, songs, and love stories. Inside the camps, those same images carried a second message. That freedom, even in its imperfections, possessed an energy tyranny could never replicate. The German prisoners would remember that energy long after they left. And soon, the moment of revelation, when laughter filled a room full of the defeated, would meet its turning point, when the ideology of the Reich collided fully with the light of the American screen. March 1945, Camp Papago Park, Arizona. The desert wind sweeps over wire and watchtower, rattling tin roofs like loose drums. Inside the recreation hall, the air smells faintly of diesel and dust. A generator coughs to life. The prisoners file in with military precision, their boots echoing against the wooden floor. The night's film, pinned to the notice board, reads simply, Casablanca. Few know what to expect. To some, it is merely another American movie, escapism for the victors. To others, it is the forbidden mirror of Europe itself. The lights dim. The projector's hum rises, and suddenly the camp disappears, replaced by the smoke-filled cafe of Rick Blaine. A German prisoner shifts uncomfortably as the screen shows Vichy officers in tailored uniforms, the swastika draped casually over Moroccan walls. The music swells, La Marseillaise, battling the Nazi anthem. In that moment, the hall grows silent. Men who once marched under that flag sit frozen, watching themselves portrayed as villains in a story whose moral center lies not in conquest, but in sacrifice. When Victor Laszlo defies the Nazi anthem, the tension inside the hall is almost physical. Some prisoners look down, others stare rigidly ahead. A few almost imperceptibly nod. What they see on screen is not propaganda. It is conviction, a vision of courage rooted not in obedience, but in conscience. The film ends. The lights flicker back to life. The projector clatters, slowing to a stop. For a long moment, no one moves. Then, unexpectedly, someone claps. Once, twice, and others follow. The applause grows awkwardly, then fades. The guards exchange glances but do not intervene. The sound is not jubilation, it is recognition. The defeated have witnessed a version of strength they had never been allowed to imagine. Afterward, in barracks conversations recorded by camp interpreters, the prisoners debate the meaning of what they saw. Some insist the film is manipulation. Others say it reflects truths they already sensed but never voiced. One writes in his diary, "If the Americans wish to conquer us, this is the way. Through belief, not bullets." That night, a guard patrolling the perimeter hears faint voices through the thin desert air. Men humming a tune they had just heard on screen. The sound drifts beyond the wire and disappears into the darkness. It is not surrender. It is something quieter, more durable. Comprehension. The flicker of the projector, once mere entertainment, has become a silent envoy of ideology. In that beam of light, the contrast between coercion and freedom stands naked. The film has done what force cannot. It has entered the enemy's imagination. And as Germany itself begins to collapse across the Atlantic, another kind of surrender is already underway, not of territory, but of certainty. The screenings continued across the American interior through the last months of the war. As Allied armies pushed into the Rhineland, hundreds of miles away in the calm of Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Georgia, the men who once carried. The cause sat before projectors and confronted its collapse on screen. Interrogation. Reports preserved in the U.S. National Archives reveal the psychological fracture forming among them. Analysts from the Special Projects Division conducted surveys after each major showing. At Camp Crossville, Tennessee, one group described the films as hypnotic, another as dangerous. A sergeant admitted, "When I see their cities untouched and their people free to laugh, I feel we were deceived." Others wrote that America's prosperity cannot come from lies alone. Censorship officers took note of subtle changes in correspondence. Letters home began to reference admiration for American efficiency, technology, and, most strikingly, its openness. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher, wrote, "If democracy means this order and decency, then we must learn it." In the same camp, a fanatic tore up the letter and denounced him to the guards, but the seed was already planted. Guards, too, sensed the transformation. They reported prisoners humming tunes from the musicals, asking for English dictionaries, requesting magazines about architecture and cinema. Some began staging their own plays, mimicking the styles they saw on screen. When questioned about motivation, one replied, "Because here, art is allowed." That sentence, simple and unscripted, captured what no propagandist could invent. The American officers observed this quiet evolution with a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction. They understood that the battle for Germany's post-war soul would not be fought with rifles, but with memory. Every frame projected in those halls was a promise of an alternative future. By 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. Yet, behind the fences of America, a different campaign was succeeding. The humanization of the enemy through exposure to a free society. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, news traveled unevenly through the camps. Some prisoners wept. Others stood silent. Others still saluted the flag lowered for the last time. That night, as word spread, the projectors rolled again. Not with triumphalist films, but with simple comedies, as if to suggest that life, not vengeance, would have the final word. A camp interpreter recorded that during a screening of Yankee Doodle Dandy, a German lieutenant murmured, almost to himself, "They fight a war and yet keep their joy." It was the recognition of a paradox. a nation at total war that still celebrated individuality and laughter. To the men raised on obedience, this was an alien kind of power, one that could not be conquered, because it refused to resemble conquest. The light of the projector lingered on their faces, casting a thin glow across uniforms now faded to gray. For many, that was the night the war truly ended. Not when Berlin fell, but when they understood that freedom's greatest weapon was not fear, but imagination. That revelation, fragile and personal, would accompany them back across the Atlantic when the fences finally opened. When the gates finally opened in 1946 and 1947, the German prisoners walked out of America's camps into a world they no longer recognized. The Reich was gone, cities lay in ash, and the soil of Europe bore the scars of annihilation. Yet, these men carried something intangible across the ocean: the memory of a different order. For thousands, the war had ended not with the echo of artillery, but with the hum of a projector. In Bremen, Cuxhaven, and the shattered towns along the Elbe, former POWs disembarked from Liberty ships and troop carriers, clutching duffel bags stamped U.S. Army. Inside, among photographs and ration tins, some carried movie posters or clippings from American magazines. They had become, unknowingly, ambassadors of a civilization they once despised. Reports by the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division noted a remarkable trend. Those who had spent years in American camps were more receptive to Reconstruction and less sympathetic to extremist movements. The seeds planted in the barracks had begun to bear fruit. When the Allies launched their program of denazification and civic education, many returning POWs became natural allies in the effort. Having seen democratic life at work, even through the narrow lens of prison routine, they became carriers of comparison. Memoirs written decades later confirm this quiet transformation. In his post-war diary, former Wehrmacht Corporal Heinz Pullman recalled, "We were prisoners, yet in some ways freer than before." They showed us their films. We saw people arguing, doubting, laughing, all the things we were told to suppress. Another veteran, Karl Haushofer, wrote that the experience disarmed us not with weapons, but with decency. For some, this new understanding was tinged with guilt. They had fought for an empire built on hatred, yet were treated humanely by the very enemy they demonized. That contradiction gnawed at them, leading many to question not just Nazism, but obedience itself. Sociologists studying the phenomenon in post-war Germany called it the Camp America effect. It described how first-hand exposure to democratic norms created ripples through communities still haunted by authoritarian instinct. The American camps had served, unintentionally, as incubators for post-war transformation. The men who once guarded fences now became teachers, engineers, and administrators in the Federal Republic's reconstruction. Many cited their time in captivity as formative. The first encounter with tolerance, with free debate, with the idea that dissent could coexist with loyalty. In Westphalia, one ex-prisoner opened a small cinema. Above its doorway hung a sign painted by hand: Lichtspiele Freiheit, Freedom Pictures. Each night, he threaded reels of imported American films through his projector, the same kind of machine that once illuminated a prison hall in Texas. He told his patrons that in those films, he had first glimpsed the world he wanted to live in. For others, the influence was quieter, more interior. They passed on to their children stories of kindness from American guards, of nights when the enemy seemed human, of movies that spoke of justice and laughter instead of commands and fear. In a Europe struggling to rediscover moral direction, those recollections mattered. They became fragments of testimony, proof that decency could outlast ideology. And through it all, the symbol remained, the flickering light of the projector, once a mere distraction in captivity, now remembered as a beacon. It had cast not shadows of propaganda, but silhouettes of possibility. When those men rebuilt their lives, they carried that light with them, not on celluloid, but in conviction. In the decades that followed, the quiet legacy of America's POW camps became a thread woven through the rebirth of Western Germany. It was invisible to the headlines, yet profoundly present in the tone of a generation. Men who had once worn the eagle and swastika, now turning their hands to rebuild a democracy. Historians would later trace part of this transformation not to speeches by generals or decrees from occupation offices, but to those nights of celluloid and light inside American camps. When the United States began its formal programs of reconstruction and reorientation under the Marshall Plan, it discovered that some of its most effective allies were former prisoners. In interviews with the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in the 1950s, these men spoke of learning trust behind barbed wire. They had seen a nation of contradictions, powerful yet self-critical, wealthy yet generous, proud yet unafraid of laughter. To them, this paradox was democracy itself. The cultural echoes were unmistakable. American films flooded post-war Europe. It's a Wonderful Life, High Noon, The Best Years of Our Lives. For millions of Germans, this was their first direct exposure to America's narrative of itself. But for the former POWs, it was déjà vu. They had seen those values before, projected in camp halls while the world still burned. Now, in their own country's ruins, those same stories offered a moral vocabulary for reconstruction. Sociologists later documented how this experience subtly undermined Soviet influence in the emerging ideological divide of the Cold War. In regions filled with repatriated prisoners from America, surveys showed a stronger identification with democratic principles and resistance to communist rhetoric. The United States had achieved what leaflets and speeches could not, a human demonstration of its creed. And yet, within that success lay an irony. Many Americans never knew this cultural campaign had taken place. The guards who threaded those reels, the officers who authorized the screenings, were simply following orders to maintain morale. But history would reveal that their unspoken civility, their willingness to treat captives as future citizens rather than permanent enemies, became a cornerstone of reconciliation. By the 1970s, historians began to name it re-education by empathy. The idea that moral transformation could arise not from punishment, but from example. It was not the loud triumph of ideology, but the quiet conviction that freedom, when lived naturally, required no defense. One of the most poignant testaments came from Gerhard Bauer, a former Luftwaffe mechanic who returned to America in 1979 as a guest of the State Department. Standing in front of a restored camp building, he told reporters, "We came as prisoners. We left as witnesses. The light they showed us, it was never turned off." That light, the projector's beam that once flickered through barracks of defeated men, became a metaphor for something larger than victory. It represented a civilization secure enough to let its enemies see its soul. And in doing so, it proved that the truest weapon of democracy is not coercion, but confidence. The story of those screenings would later fade into the margins of war history, overshadowed by battles and politics. Yet in its quietness lies its power. The United States had not merely imprisoned its enemies, it had illuminated them. Each reel of film, each evening of laughter, was a small declaration that ideas need no uniform and freedom no permission. And so, when historians look back at the strange phenomenon of German POWs watching Hollywood films, they see more than a curiosity. They see the moment when cinema became diplomacy, when compassion outperformed propaganda, and when light, simple, mechanical, relentless, carried the shape of liberty across the faces of the conquered. In the darkness of a Texas night, a generator hummed, and a narrow beam of light spilled across the faces of defeated men. That light, pale, trembling, relentless, became something greater than its purpose. It was not meant to redeem or convert, only to entertain. Yet, as it passed through dust and smoke, it carried with it the essence of a nation that believed persuasion was stronger than punishment, and curiosity deeper than fear. Long after the reels stopped spinning, the memory endured. The prisoners returned to a continent of ruins, but within them burned a small, unquenchable image. A world where laughter was not forbidden, where a government could be questioned, where the hero's strength lay in mercy, not command. They had seen the architecture of freedom projected upon a wall of wood and canvas, and it had changed the way they measured power. The hum of that projector became the pulse of an idea: that democracy does not shout. It glows. It convinces not by decree, but by example. And in the end, it was not armies or edicts that carried America's spirit into the post-war world, but this, the flicker of a light bulb in a dusty hall, revealing to former enemies that liberty's truest triumph is the ability to illuminate without burning. Even now, the story endures in that timeless image. Men once sworn to tyranny, sitting in silence, their faces softened by the silver light of a Hollywood dream. They did not yet know it, but they were watching the first frames of their own redemption. A testament to the quiet, steady power of freedom, and to the strange grace of a civilization that conquered, not by darkness, but by light.